Hola! You can use this video to either preview or review the crucial Spanish 1501 topic of the past tense. Spanish has a lot of different ways to talk about the past, and in Spanish 1501 you're going to learn the three most important. The first is the presente perfecto, or present perfect. An example is hemos comido, meaning we have eaten. So this one is not too, you shouldn't have any trouble with it. The conjugation is similar to what we do in English, hemos comido, have eaten, and also it's used similarly to how we use the present perfect in English. The pretérito is the simple past. An example is comí, I ate. And the conjugation will take a fair amount of work to learn because even the regular verbs are really different from what you're used to from the present, and there are lots of irregulars. In contrast, the imperfecto, like comía, which you can translate either as I ate, or I used to eat, or I was eating, it's super easy to conjugate with only three irregulars. So the real challenge you're going to have is with the imperfecto is knowing when to use it versus the pretérito, because there's a subtle difference in how you use the two tenses. So this will be a challenge to you as learners, similar to the challenge you faced when learning ser and estar, or por and para. So what you're going to want to focus on in your studying is how to conjugate the preterite and when to use the preterite versus the imperfect. As I said, the presente perfecto is pretty similar in Spanish and in English. In this regard, it reminds me a lot of the presente progresivo, the present progressive, which you learned in 1002. So the present progressive was like estoy comiendo, estás hablando, and this was a two-part thing. You have the verb to be, which here was estar, and then you have the gerund, which ends in ing in English and ando or yendo in Spanish. But it's the same idea. Estoy comiendo, I am eating. Estás hablando, you are speaking. So just as that is neatly parallel to English, so too the presente perfecto is neatly parallel to the present perfect in English. So when we say I have studied or you have served, we're combining some form of the verb to have with a past participle form, which is the official name. So in English that would be studied or served. So to do it in Spanish, you're not going to use the verb tener. There's a different verb meaning to have, which is habere, which is haber, and it's conjugated asa, hemos, habéis, an, and then the past participle is going to end in ado or ido, although there's, of course, some irregulars. So again, it's just like English. I have studied is just like he estudiado, and you have served is just like has servido. The use of the presente perfecto, or present perfect, is also very similar in the two languages. So if you ask in English, have you eaten? So this is, you're asking about something that happened in the past. It's sort of like, did you eat? Except when you ask, have you eaten? First of all, you're using the present tense have, right? Not had. But more importantly, you're asking about eating in the past that's somehow relevant to the present. So if you ask your friend, have you eaten? Well, maybe you're looking for somebody to eat with. Maybe you want to know if your friend is hungry. So their eating in the past should be relevant to the present. And it's the same thing when you ask somebody in Spanish, has comido. It's have you eaten in the past, but what about now? Another example, no he hecho la tarea, I haven't done the homework. So if you say that, maybe you're hinting that now in the present you need help. Maybe you're worried that you're in bad shape for the Spanish test that you're going to have today. So the basic pattern is you're talking about the past, but with relevance to the present. The use of the other two past tenses that you'll learn, the pretérito and imperfecto, is considerably more difficult because because Spanish speakers make a distinction that English doesn't care about. So in English, if you say last night I ate soup for dinner, or when I was a girl I ate soup for dinner every night, you can just say ate and ate. It's the same verb form. But in Spanish, this is two different ways of looking at your past eating behavior. So if you're just talking about what happened last night, you're going to use the simple past, the pretérito, which would be comí. But if you're talking about how things used to be in the past, that will be comía, which is the imperfect. That's a really big and deeply ingrained difference in Spanish that you just have to get used to. Again, it's like learning ser versus estar, or learning por versus para. These are things that you just really don't know at all in English, but you have to pick up a sensibility to them in order to speak proper Spanish. So this is why I said before that one of the two most challenging things that you'll need to do with the past tense is learn when to use the preterite and when to use the imperfect. The other one I mentioned is the challenge of just conjugating the preterite. So let's take a look at that. The regular preterite conjugation sounds very different from the present. It's going to go like this for AR verbs: hablé, hablaste, habló, hablamos, hablastes, hablaron. And for ERs and IRs, it'll be like comí, comiste, comió, comimos, comistes, comieron. So this sounds weird to ears that are used to the present. For one thing, you have the final stress on hablé and habló, comí and comió. You have nothing like that in the present tense. And then the to form doesn't end in an S, although actually a lot of native speakers will add the S if they haven't had a strong education. And then there we have an O ending in the third person singular, and we're used to seeing it in the yo form. So one technique that I recommend for getting a feeling for the rhythm of these forms, if you don't mind just being embarrassed, is to sing the conjugation like a hunting horn. So hablar would be hablé, hablaste, habló, hablamos, hablastes, hablaron. And then comer would be comí, comiste, comió, comimos, comistes, comieron. So if you can do that when nobody else is listening and get it into your head, then you can refer back to it. I really recommend it. The conjugation of the preterite is complicated by the fact that there are tons of irregulars. In order to master them, I recommend that you use a divide and conquer strategy. And you can go to my website, SpanishLinguist.us, and download the Todo el Pretérito handout on the teaching page, and you'll see this nice table which breaks up the different categories of preterites. So on the top, we have the verbs that have that regular accentuation pattern: hablé, hablaste, habló. So here's regular AR, regular ER, and IR. Then there's a bunch of words that have spelling changes. These are totally predictable. So busqué, so buscar goes to busqué, jugar goes to jugué. So they sound right, it's just you have to change the spelling. And look, with leer and construir, you're going to, when you go leo and leyeron, you're going to add a Y, just like you're used to already for the gerund, leyendo, construyendo. In this category, these are IR verbs that have the boot change in the present tense. So like pedir goes to pido, dormir goes to duermo, sentir goes to siento, repetir goes to repito, etc. So these verbs in the preterite are totally normal for the first and second person, but they have a change in the third person. So the ones that have an E in the root go to I, and the ones with an O go to U. So you have like dormir, dormiste, dormio, dormimos, dormistes, dormieron, which is somehow hard to say. So then there's a bunch of irregulars which sound very different because they don't have that characteristic preterite hunting horn rhythm. So ir and ser are identical in the past tense, and somehow it doesn't end up being a problem. Dart and ver are very short, and then there's a big category here of irregulars that have a major change, like hacer goes to hice, andar goes to anduve, estar goes to estuve, etc. So what I recommend for these is, first of all, you memorize hice, hiciste, hizo, hicimos, hicistes, hicieron, because those are the endings, and the rhythm, the not hunting horn, just a regular rhythm that you'll have for this whole category. And then you memorize the yo forms for each. So andar, anduve, estar, estuve, poder, pude. So if you know the yo, you're good to go because you can just continue. So if you know that querer corresponds to quise, well, then you roll it out. From quise, you have quise, quisiste, quiso, quisimos, quisises, quisieron. And again, that's based on practicing hacer. So it's complicated, but again, divide and conquer. I cannot recommend highly enough that you practice the preterite on conjuguemos.com. Actually, if you take one thing out of this video, it is that conjuguemos.com will be your best friend. And while you're practicing, it's always a good idea to say the words out loud, because that way they go into your head more, because they can enter through your ears as well as your eyes. In contrast, the imperfecto, the imperfect, is super easy to conjugate. The ARs go like aba, so cantaba, cantabas, etc. The ERs and IRs go like ia, ias, etc. And there's only 3 irregular verbs. Ir goes like iba, ibas, ser goes like era, eras, and ver goes like beia, beias. So piece of cake. The challenge then is to know when to use which conjugation. Do you want preterite or do you want imperfect when you're talking about the past? I find it very helpful to keep 2 metaphors in mind when wrestling with this issue of preterite versus imperfect in the past. So what are you doing when you talk about the past? Maybe you're telling a story. Maybe you're narrating. This happened, that happened, whatever. And in that case, the metaphor of beads on a string, beads on a necklace, is very useful. Or maybe you're just describing, talking about somebody that you knew. And in that case, the metaphor of a box that can be closed or open is, I think, most helpful. Let's start with the beads on a string metaphor for narrating in the past. So here we see that the basic purpose of the pretérito is to lay out events that happen in sequence, like beads on the string. So here's a story about hurting yourself and going to the hospital. So it starts with, ayer me desperté a las 9. So that's the first thing that happened. The después me duché, that's the second thing, and desayuné, and these are all in the preterite. The third thing is I fell down, me caí, and what happened as a result of that? Me rompí la pierna. And the last thing that happened is I went to the hospital. Finalmente fui a un hospital cerca del campus. So bing, bang, bang, these events in sequence, beads on a string, they're all in the pretérito. Notice that when I put together this little breaking your leg story, I included a lot of expressions of time and sequence. So ayer, a las 9, those are expressions of time. Después is sequence, and finalmente is sequence. So because you've got this beads on a string thing where you have a sequence of events and each one happens at some point in time, specifications of time or sequence are very useful indications that you need to use the preterite. And that's especially on a test. If you see a las 9, if you see después, if you see finalmente, then that's like, hello, use the preterite. However, you should know that in real life, these are not always present. I mean, look at the middle, the one with me caí, that doesn't have something. And they also don't guarantee that it's preterite, but it's a very strong indication, and it will be useful for you in this class. So if the pretérito is for laying out events that happen in sequence, like beads on a string, what is the purpose of the imperfecto? It is used in a narrative to add additional information. What kind of additional information? Well, one type is background information. So let's say I'm talking about, as I said, today I woke up at 9. I might want to bring up as a background to that the fact that I used to wake up a lot earlier when I was in high school. Me despertaba más temprano en la secundaria. So me despertaba, I used to wake up. Anytime you're talking about used to, and again, this is as background to a specific event that happened during a past narrative, that is going to be the imperfecto. Another type of background is is introduced with the word mientras, meaning while, or sometimes cuando. And so when I say me caí, I fell down, I haven't said, like that it happened at a specific time or something. So if I want to give some background information about what was going on when I fell, I can say mientras caminaba a mi clase, while I was walking to my class. And that just, again, sets up the background for the catastrophic event. So if you picture that mientras caminaba a mi clase, I'm walking along and then boom, me caí, that pattern of a background event that's going on with mientras and the imperfecto, and then the interrupting event in the pretérito is classic. And again, you can also use it with cuando. So when I was walking, I fell down. That would work also. Another type of additional information is descriptions. So when I went to breakfast, I could mention that había mucha gente en la cafetería, that the cafeteria, there were a lot of people in the cafeteria, that it was crowded. So again, that's not an event. It's not one of our events in sequence that make up our story. It's description to add color, like color commentary in sports broadcasting. It's adding color to the event of eating breakfast. Or here, when I go to the hospital, I can talk about its name. I can say, se llamaba St. Barnabas. So that's, again, not something that happened. It's description. It's additional information. So in a narrative, you're normally going to be combining the pretérito and the imperfecto in order to put together this picture of what were the events that were happening and what was background information and description that provides additional details. So let's look at how our little story comes together. Ayer me desperté a las 9. That's the first thing that happened. Me despertaba más temprano en la secundaria. That's some background information about how my sleep patterns used to be. Después, me duché y desayuné. So the next two things that happened. Then we're going to describe, había mucha gente en la cafetería. And then we're going to resume our narrative with me caí, but first we're going to say what was happening when I fell as a kind of background. Mientras caminaba a mi clase, me caí y me rompí la pierna. And then the last thing that happened, finalmente fui a un hospital cerca del campus, and we'll describe it. Se llamaba St. Barnabas. The other metaphor that I find useful for preterite versus imperfect has to do when you're not narrating the past per se, but you're just describing something. And I like the metaphor of the pretérito as something like a label that you put on a closed box, a caja cerrada. And you do this when you want to, in your description, identify or summarize something that you're describing. So let's say you're talking about George Washington. Well, what's the big thing about George Washington? He was the first president of the United States. So there's the label on the box, and we'll use the pretérito to express it. Jorge Washington fue el primer presidente de los Estados Unidos. Now, what if we want to give a more ample description? We don't just want to identify him. We don't just want to summarize who he was and his importance. So now we're going to open the box, and we're going to describe more fully who was George Washington, some of his characteristics. He was from Virginia, he always told the truth, he had really bad teeth. So again, pretérito to identify, and then imperfecto for more of a full description. It doesn't always work, but it's a useful metaphor. To wrap up this video, I thought it might be helpful for you to see where these past tenses fit in the overall scheme of all the different verb forms that you're learning when you learn Spanish in our program and also more generally. So in 1001 or 1002, look at how much you've already learned. You learned the present, including reflexive verbs, ser and estar, gustar. You've learned to use tener que to talk about what you have to do. You learned the se impersonal. You've learned to talk about the future using ir a plus infinitivo, vamos a visitarlo. And you've learned to use estar plus the gerundio to talk about what is going on right now. And finally, you have learned to make affirmative commands. So it's pretty amazing. In 1501, the main thing you're going to do is these three past tenses. But you're also going to take estar plus the gerundio, so that's the present progressive, and move it into the past using the imperfecto. So if you say estaban leyendo, it means they were reading, and that's a kind of a background to something that was going to happen. So you could say, for example, estaba caminando cuando me caí, as an alternative to using the imperfect. You're going to learn how to do negative commands, and then the future conjugation, which you can use instead of ir a. But this is used, the future conjugation is used less and less. When you get into 1501, the big topic is going to be the subjunctive, which is actually a lot easier than preterite versus imperfect because the times when you use it are very well specified. You'll learn the conditional, which is like would in English, cantarías, you would sing. And then you'll learn this horrible sounding pluscuamperfecto. That's just taking the present perfect and putting it in the past. So if you say, he comido, I have eaten, you can say, había comido, I had eaten. That's all it is. It's got a big name for a kind of a nothing burger. And then in 2001, you'll wrap up learning more uses of the subjunctive, and you will learn the past tense subjunctive, the imperfecto del subjuntivo. So Spanish really has an amazing verb system, and by the time we're done with you, you will pretty much be done with it. Adios.